All right, let's start. So as I have mentioned in our group chat, this will conclude the lessons that are included in your first module. So we started with the different types of functions. We discussed the polynomial functions, the ano pa ba yun? The rational functions, the radical functions. We also discussed the transcendental functions, specifically the trigonometric functions. We also have the exponential functions, the logarithmic functions. And today we will be having some of our special functions. We will be meeting more of these functions when we go further to this course. So we will be focusing on two special functions, namely our step functions and our piecewise functions. So let's again have a GeoGebra file together with our board here. The step functions, they are actually called step functions because of the nature, yung itsura ng kanilang graph. We start with the graph of the greatest integer function, otherwise called as our floor function. So you can see here that it looks like a step. That's why it's one of the step functions. So basically there are two step functions. Their specific names are the greatest integer function. The other name for that is the floor function, and the other step function is what we call the least integer function or the ceiling function. So let's start with the first one. We're going to use the notations. So when we see this notation, it means we are pertaining to a step function, particularly the floor function. So our guide here is actually this one here. The horizontal part, it's at the lower part, it's in the floor, nasa baba. And then we put our variable. So basically, what does this mean? So it's a function. You could think of this as a machine from which you input a number, and those set of numbers are called the domain, di ba? And of course, it will give us back another number, the output. So ito yung output kung ano man yung ibibigay niya dyan. And for this particular special function, the domain here is the real number, the set of real numbers, but the output is not necessarily, it's of course a real number, but not the other types of real numbers such as the irrational numbers, for example. Why is that? Because this is called the greatest integer function. Whatever number that we use as an input, or we put here as an input, the answer is always an integer. So first, it's an integer, and that integer is always less than or equal to x, your input. So yung sagot niya, yung ibibigay niya na sagot, our output, cannot be greater than x. Okay? So it's an integer that is less than or equal to x. And it should be the greatest integer. Yung pinakamataas na integer na mas mababa or equal to our input. So, ano yung halimbawa nito? Just to give you an idea of how we evaluate a floor function. Just for example, we have our input as, say, 2.2. So 2.2 is our input. What should be our answer? Anyone? Greatest integer, pinakamataas na integer na mas mababa or equal to 2.2. What is our answer? What should be our answer? Come again?
2 po.
2. Okay, bakit 2? Well, 2 is an integer. We know that. And it is less than 2.2. So we are okay. Na-meet natin yung condition ng function na ito. So yun lang naman yung gagawin natin dito. This is just what we mean by the floor function. So basically, we just drop whatever the decimal value and then just get that integer. So it has to be lower than our input. What if our input is exactly 2? So what is the answer? What if this is, our input is exactly 2?
No, sir.
Well, of course, the answer is still 2. This is the greatest integer that is equal to our input. Remember that our condition is the output must be less than or equal. So any of the two. So if our input is an integer, the answer is that integer itself. That's what we mean by the floor function. Now let's move on to negative integers. What if our input is a negative number, say 3.9? What is the value?
-4.
Negative?
-4, sir.
Negative 3, negative 4. Everyone, will you please participate? You can use our chat box. Gamitin natin yung chat box.
-4 po.
Negative 4? Negative 4 kaya or negative 3?
-4. Sorry, -3, sir. -3.
Negative?
-4.
Okay. So what is our condition again? It should be an integer. So we have to drop the decimal part. But it has to be, since we are talking about the floor function, it will be an integer that is less than, right? Less than, katulad ng ginawa natin dito. So 2 is less than 2.2, of course. But if your answer here is -3, then you have to ask yourself, is -3 less than -3.9? Since we are talking about negative numbers, that's not the case. So the integer that is less than -3.9 is actually -4. So tama kayo. Tama. Majority of you are correct on saying that the answer here is -4. Of course, if our input is an exact negative integer, say -5, the answer is -5 pa rin. So do you have any other question regarding the floor function? Can you think of another example that is not represented in the examples given here?
Sir, what if yung gagamitin na input?
Fraction. So your input is 1/2. Well, what is 1/2? It can be translated or rewritten as a decimal, right?
Sir.
So 1/2 is just 0.5. So there's nothing special here. What is that lower integer that is less than 0.05?
0.
0.
Sir.
Yes.
0, sir.
That's correct. The answer is 0. So actually our input is any real number. What if our input is an irrational number, for example? So pi is our answer. Our input, sorry. What is pi? It's approximately 3.1416, right? And it doesn't actually matter the other numbers here because this is a step function. We are actually interested of the first few decimal values here. So what is that integer? Less than this one, of course. That is the greatest. So the answer is 3. So it doesn't really matter. Kapag fraction yan na binigay or irrational number, our domain kasi is the real number. So whatever real number that we input, there should be an answer. Now, before I forget, if the domain is the set of real numbers, what should be the range? We can base our answer from this graph. So basically, the reason why it's the set of real numbers, if you notice, every number in the x-axis is covered by the graph. But when we look at the y-axis, for instance, let's specify this one, between 0 and 1. So the green here represents the graph of the floor function. Is there a part of the graph aligned or covered by, or does the graph cover any number here between 1 and 0? If you notice, it's just a space, walang graph dyan. So the graph covers only at y equal to 0, that's 1, another at y equal to 1, another at y equal to 2, another at y equal to -1, and so on, so forth. Because again nga, the step functions, the input are always integer. So what should be the range of this function? That's the set of the possible inputs. Diba? Lahat ng possible na input na pwede nating ilagay sa function, that's the definition of a domain. Pwede mo bang ilagay ang fraction? Pwede mo bang ilagay ang integer mismo? Pwede mo bang ilagay yung irrational numbers na parang ginawa natin? Yes. So basically, any real number can be an input. That's the domain. And by graph nga, we can see that all numbers here is covered by the graph. What do we mean by all numbers ba kasi covered by the graph? For instance, -0.05, it's a number in the x-axis. If we trace it, it's actually corresponding to the graph. It's covered by the graph. Even -1. If we move further to these numbers, for instance, -3.5, that's covered by this part of the graph, -3.5. That's the domain. But what I'm asking you is the range. Are all numbers in the y-axis covered by the graph? Or if we based it in the definition of the range is the set of all outputs, all possible outputs for the function. So this is just the set of the all possible inputs, that's the domain, but for the range, that's the set of all outputs. Because this is a step function, what should be the range?
Sir, set of all integers.
Set of all integers. Tama. So, tama lang yun. Kasi nga, ang sagot natin, yung output natin sa function na ito ay dapat integer. So, we can basically write the range is, ano na yung symbol natin ng integer? In the first part of this chapter, ganyan. Sometimes, we write I, integer. Set of all integers. So that's the range. It's not the set of real numbers. It's actually a, what do you call this? A subset of this. So what does it mean? What does it mean further? You can never have an output na ang sagot ay 0.2, for example, decimal. So basically, ganun din yung isa pang step function. What is that other step function? Because we have 2. It's called the ceiling function. By symbol, nasa taas, no, yung horizontal part. Parang bracket siya na dito lang, sa taas. Ceiling. Nasa ceiling yung part na ganyan. And again, it's a step function. The second step function that we have. What is the definition of this function? So instead of taking the greatest integer that is less than or equal to our input, what we are actually looking now is the least, meaning pinakamababa, na mas mataas or equal to the input. Let's provide examples so that you can imagine it better. For example, our input now is 3.1. Since we are talking about the ceiling value, the ceiling function value, or the value of this function, ano yung sagot natin dapat?
4.
So it should be again an integer, but it has to be greater than or equal to 3.1. So our answer should be 4. What if our answer is exactly 3? Wala pa rin problema. Our answer should be
3.
3, just the same. Because of that word or equal from the definition. How about if we are dealing with negative numbers? Negative, let's say 9.8. It has to be greater than
Negative 9. Negative 9. Negative 9.
it has to be greater than negative 9.8. And what is that? Tama, it's negative 9. Negative 8? May negative 9 pa, di ba? Negative 8 is of course greater than negative 9.8, but we are taking the least. So, lesser pa rin yung negative 9. Parang ni-round off natin, di ba? Ni-round off natin pataas because negative 9 is higher than negative 9. So basically, in our number line, that's negative 8, that's negative 9, that's negative 10. Our input is somewhere here, negative 9.8. Ang kukunin natin, yung sagot natin, ay yung pinakamababa pero mas mataas pa sa input natin. So that's the negative 9 is near to negative 9.8. So hindi ito yung sagot. Hindi rin ito yung sagot, no? Negative 10. Kung sana ang tinatanong ay the floor function, floor value of negative 9.8. Ano yung sagot natin dito? Balik tayo sa una. If this is a floor function,
10. Negative 10.
yun na yung magiging sagot natin na negative 10. But we are in the ceiling function. Right. So I guess nakuha ninyo yun. Domain and range is just the same. The domain is any real number. So you can input any real number in our ceiling function. But the outputs is limited only to the integer because by definition the outputs has to be an integer. So basically what I want you to master here is how to evaluate our different step functions. Whole numbers, as I can see in our chat box, I suppose that was your answer sa sagot natin na integers. It's not whole numbers because it does not include the negative numbers, negative integers. Alright then, let's proceed to the last special function, and actually the last function for this chapter. It's called the piecewise function. Piecewise functions, these are functions that are actually composed of different pieces of functions. That's the definition. Piecewise. We focus on the term piece. So a piecewise function is composed of more than one function. It could be 2, it could be 3, or it could be more. Let's provide a very simple example of a piecewise function. So since this is still a function, then we can actually use our notation for a function. I'm going to define a piecewise function composed of two pieces. And let's make use siguro of algebraic functions muna. So my first piece is a quadratic function. It's a polynomial of degree 2. And my second piece, siguro gusto ko ngayon ng rational function, x minus 1. And because there are two pieces in my function, I would have to define the domain or the interval from which each piece is defined. So the value of the function is based from the first piece. If your input x, so x is a representation of an input. If your input is say greater than or equal to 1, if my input here is greater than or equal to 1, so 1 is included here, or 1.1, 1.2, anything that is greater than 1, to evaluate the function, I'm going to make use of the first piece. However, if my input happens to be less than 1, then I'm going to make use the second piece of the function. So basically, the first step to evaluate this function is to look where does the input is located. In terms of a number line, yung pagkakahati kasi is at x equal to 1. So if x is greater than or equal to 1, we're going to make use of x squared plus 1. But if it's less than, we're going to make use of the rational function 1 over x minus 1. That is an example of a piecewise function. Now, let us evaluate this function. So, what do we mean? We are given our find for the corresponding output the value of the function if you want to use that. Let us evaluate 2. So what is the value of the function if our input is 2? So what again is our first step? We need to locate where is this input included at. Is it here? Is it in the first piece or in the second piece? First or second? First, because, well, it's greater than 1. 2 is greater than 1. So to evaluate this one, ang gagamitin lang natin is the first piece. Hahayaan natin, hindi natin ito gagamitin itong second piece. So the common error is the students evaluate f of 2 sa dalawang pieces. That is incorrect. Dapat isa pa rin yung value ng ating function. Otherwise, it's not anymore considered a function. Alright, so we identified which piece of the function we're going to use to evaluate the function. It's x squared plus 1. So basically, we substitute 2 doon sa lahat ng x doon sa first piece. Isa lang naman, that's the x squared, and then we simply add 1. So this is like 2 squared plus 1. We are following the first piece. The answer here is 5. 4 plus 1, that is 5. What if we're going to evaluate this one? So f of, say, negative 5. What piece are we going to use? First or second?
Second.
How do we know that? Because negative 5 is less than 1.
It's less than 1.
So we're going to make use of just that second piece. So 1 over x, which is negative 5, minus 1. And then simplify. So we have negative 6. This is rewritten as negative 1 over 6. That's it. What if we are going to evaluate exactly at x equal to 1? So f of 1. What are we going to use? Which piece? 1 or 2? First or second?
First
First pa rin, kasi andito yung 1 that's greater than or equal to 1. It's exactly equal to 1, so walang problema. That is still in the first piece. So we have 1 squared plus 1. The answer is 2. So ganun lang yan. Kung decimal yan, walang problema kasi malalaman pa rin naman natin yan kung greater than or equal to 1 or less than 1. Sige, let's provide an example. This time, let's name our function g of x para hindi laging f of x. So basically, in our x-axis, it's divided into 3 regions. It's at 5, it's at 2, and that's it. So if it's greater than 5, ito, so hindi kasama itong 5. Basta pag mas malaki siya sa 5, we're going to make use of the first piece. Pero kapag nasa gitna, it's greater than or equal to 5, but it's less than, by the way, it's less than or equal to 5, but greater than or equal to 2. This is an inequality na dalawang inequality ito. We start reading at the middle. This is read as x greater than or less than or equal to 5, but greater than or equal to 2. It's just the same when we read this one as x greater than or equal to 2, but less than or equal to 2. The important thing is at the middle. So if it's greater than or equal to 2, but less than or equal to 5, the second piece should be used, which is the floor function. But if x is less than 2, so any number less than 2, so that extends to the negative numbers, diba? That's 1, that's 0, negative 1, and so on. We're going to make use of the third piece. So let's try to evaluate some. Let's try to evaluate g of 1. Which piece are we going to use?
Third.
Third piece, sir.
Third piece.
Third, sir.
So we're simply going to make use of 2 raised to x. Wala na tayong pakialam dun sa dalawa. 2 raised to x. But x is set to be, so yun yung input natin, 1. What is the answer then? What's the final answer? Yun lang. Yun lang naman yung piecewise function. G of, let's say, 7.987.
First piece.
Fourth piece, sir.
The first piece. So that is the ceiling function. 7.987. What is the answer then?
8.
8. G of 2.0001. Second piece. What is the answer?
2.
Huh?
Two, sir.
Yeah, ganun lang. Do you need more examples or that's enough? By the way, how about the range and domain?
More, sir.
What is the domain of this function, piecewise function? Well, it's given, right? Ito. So, ito lang yung pwede nating pagpilian na input. If we put it this way, makikita natin that this is representing the real. So, every real number is represented by the 3. So, if we take the union of this one, meaning if we combine all their elements, that is just the same as the set of real numbers.
Real numbers.
For the range, we need to graph this one. Pero ang range pa lang ng ano, 'di ba? Ng nabasa. We need to graph this one. If you notice, 'di ba? Ano yung graph ng exponential function? But we only have to start from 2. Yan. Diba? Yan yung ating graph ng exponential function dito. How about the step function? Let's start with the floor function. So between 2 and 5. Siyempre, yung makukuha natin dyan ay yung mga step natin. And then ganun sa first function, first piece for x greater than 5. Step functions pa rin yung makukuha natin dyan. So if we look at the graph, there's nothing, the graph does not cover anything at the lowest point, including 0 kasi si exponential function yan. So our range here, is, that's the positive real numbers. Let's name that. Let me start by naming that siguro h of x para may iba. How many pieces would you like? So, well, basically, ano yung domain natin dito? It's not the real numbers because wala namang 6, hindi natin pwedeng maging input yung 6. Tama?
Yes, sir.
Ano pa ang hindi pwede? X is less than 0. So, anything that is less than 0, negative numbers is it's included here. So, our domain here, we can make use of the interval notation to write the domain. It's negative infinity. So, any negative numbers until
5.
5 but excluding 5. Tama?
Yes, sir.
So we use parentheses. So if we use the interval notation for any of the two infinities, positive yan or negative, we use the parentheses. Tapos for numbers, if 5 is included, we use this one. What is this? A bracket. Pero kapag 5 is not included, kasi walang equal doon, then we use a parenthesis. So that's one way to write a set. This is still a set, the domain of this piecewise function. Now let's try to evaluate some. Each of, say, 4. How do we evaluate this one? Ano?
First piece.
We use the first
Third.
because 4 is in this interval. So 4 raised to 4 plus 1. Tama?
Yes, sir.
That is 4 raised to 5. What is 4 raised to 5?
1,024.
1,024.
24.
Okay. What if we evaluate 3 point what if we evaluate 3.1?
Number 2, sir.
Second piece, sir.
Second piece. Ano ba ang 3.1? Is it less than 3?
Greater than, sir.
So first piece pa rin.
First piece, sir.
4. So our answer should be 4 raised to 3.1 plus 1. So 4 raised to 4.1.
2.1.
What is the answer?
$294.07.
We can approximate, no? That's not the exact number. So by approximation, the answer is 294.07. So it's just an approximation. If we want an exact answer, we can stop it here. 4 is to 4.1. How about h of 0?
Second piece, sir.
Second piece. So what is our answer? Huh? That is
Square root of 2, sir.
square root of. That's it?
Square root of 2, sir.
Yes, that's it. Because the second piece is a constant function. So anong ibig sabihin nun? Basta ang input natin ay magmula 0 hanggang 3, excluding 0 and 3, the value of the function h of x is always square root of 2. So if I ask you what is the value of 0.1, h of 0.1,
Square root of 2, sir.
square root of 2. H of 1.11111111. OA. Pero sige.
Square root of 2, sir.
Square root of,
Square root of
because this number is still included in this second piece. How about h of 3?
Square root of 2, sir.
Square root of 2 pa rin siya lang. So walang actually i-compute dito because this is just a constant function. That's the second piece. H of negative 1.
Sir.
The last piece.
Third piece.
Alright. Before we present the answer, will you please tell us first your answers?
0.
Palitan ko ito ng negative 1.2 na lang. But your answer is negative 1.4, but remember our outer function is the floor function. So the answer should be an integer. Tama?
Negative 2, sir.
Negative 1, negative 1, negative 2, negative 2. Okay. Sige, let's now answer. So of course, our inside function is a polynomial function, so you need to substitute negative 1.2 to the polynomial function. But there's another function outside it, that's the floor function. So dapat, ang final answer natin is an integer. So how do we do that? We substitute 2 times negative 1.2 plus 1. Minding of course the outer function na floor function. So let us simplify first whatever is inside, and then that's the time after doing that we apply the floor function. So what's negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 1.4? That would give us negative
2.2.
2.2, 2.4.
4.
Plus, may plus 1 pa tayo dyan. Simplifying further, the inside part, we will have negative 1.4.
4.
Alright, so we have now a single number. This is the floor function again, so we take the lower integer. What is lower than negative 1.4?
Negative 2.
Because these are negative numbers, yes, the answer is
Negative 2.
negative 2. Alright, so that's it. I think you can handle other questions here, other examples. Okay, siguro final example na. I think we haven't used trigonometric functions. So let's create a piecewise function. I'm going to name this one as p of x. But the pieces are the trigonometric function. So ano yung domain nito? Well, of course, we can tell already the domain. Yung pagkakahati ng ating intervals dito ay sa pi lamang. So basta mataas sa pi, we use the first piece. If it's less than, so any number less than pi, we use the second piece. So that is the same as the set of real numbers. So everything in the number line can be an input. So the domain is still the set, of course, of real numbers. Okay, now let's try to evaluate this function at specific x values or at specific inputs. Let's start with pi mismo. If our input is pi, so p of pi, which piece are we going to use?
First piece. First piece.
Obviously, it's the first piece. So how do we evaluate? We copy the function and then substitute the input, which is pi. Ito na yung kailangan nating i-review. How do we solve this one? Now, pwede natin gamitin yung calculators natin. That's one.
0.055, sir.
0.0.
0.05.
0.055, sir.
Or that is an approximation. Okay, let's make use of this calculator. Make sure that we are in the radians mode. So 4. I-set natin yan. Dapat makita natin sa calculator natin na in radians ang angle natin. Because sa given na function, the x values, the inputs should be in radians. Just to make it consistent. So we want to solve for the sign of pi. Pi is dito sa baba. So it will give us 0. Saan yung kinuha yung 3 something? 0 point something. 0.055. I think hindi nyo pinalitan in degrees kasi yung calculator ninyo. So it has to be
Yes, sir. Hindi.
0. Diba? Sige, review. Bakit nga ba 0 kasi? This is 0 degrees. This is pi over 2. This is pi. This is 3 pi over 2. Babalik siya sa 2 pi. Siyempre, merong mga in-between angles dyan. Let's have na lang the special ones. Pi over 4. And then we have pi over 6, pi over 3, and so on, so forth. Since these are points in the Cartesian plane, there are corresponding ordered pair na naka-associate sa kanila. So for example, si 0 degree at 6 saka si 2 pi, ang ordered pair dyan ay 1, 0. 1, 0. Dito ay square root of 2 over 2, square root of 2 over 2. Dito ay square root of 3 over 2 at saka 1/2. Dito ay 1/2 square root of 3 over 2. Ito ay 0, 1. Dito ay negative 1, 0. Dito ay 0, negative 1, and so on, so forth. So pag sinabi nating sine of an angle, hanapin natin yung angle. So nandito si pi, at dahil sine function yan, kukunin natin yung y coordinate or the second coordinate, which is 0. Kaya yung nilabas ni calculator dyan ay 0. If we are solving for the cosine, so instead of sine, cosine of pi. Cosine of pi. Pag cosine yung function natin, we focus on the x coordinate or the first coordinate. So, the answer for cosine, so halimbawa lang na sinusolve natin yung value ng cosine pi, our answer is obviously negative 1. Okay, let me just test you. What is sine of pi over 6? Pi over 6. Sine of pi over 6. Ah? 1/2. This is 1/2. What is cosine pi over 6? Cosine pi over 6.
Square root of pi over 2.
Yan, yung first coordinate yung kunin natin. What is sine of pi over 4? This is pi over 4. Or that's the same as 45 degrees. Sine. Ano yung sine value ng pi over 4?
0.5.
0.5? Ito oh, nakasulat. Hindi ba nakikita?
Square root of 2 over 2.
Yes, square root of 2 over 2. I-verify natin, kahit sa calculator, ganun din yung sasabihin niya. Sine of, say, pi over 4. Ang bibigay niya is square root of 2 over 2 pa rin. So that's how we evaluate trigonometric function. Okay, going back to our topic. We are evaluating this piecewise function. Piecewise function. It so happened that the pieces are trigonometric functions. We started evaluating p of pi. Pi is, under the first piece, sine of pi is 0. P of, say, 3 pi over 2. What piece are we going to use here?
Yung second.
Second ba? Is 3 pi over 2
First, sir.
here or in dito?
First pi.
First. 3 over 2 kaya to? 1.5 pi, kumbaga. That is greater than pi. So we still make use of the first piece. So we have sine of 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 yung nasa baba kanina. Ano yun? Or we can make use of our calculator. 3 pi over...
Negative 1, sir. Negative 1.
The answer is negative. Yes. Alright. Another example, what if we are solving for p of pi over 4? Which piece are we going to make use?
Second, sir.
Second. And that function is 2 cosine. So 1 pi over 4 is less than pi. Kaya second nga. Cosine 3 pi over 4. So 3 times pi over 4. This is the same as 2 cosine 3 pi over 4. 2 cosine, I'm using my calculator, 3 pi over 4. The answer is negative square root of
2.
Yeah, so ganun lang. Questions? Do you have questions now? Yes, ano yan?
Sir, paano po pag i-graph namin yung piecewise function? Gagawa po ba ng table of values for each piece?
Just for you to be able to visualize. So bakit ganyan yung graph nito? If we look at the pieces, there are 4 pieces. Naka-GeoGebra siya kaya hindi niya nasulat ng parang yung ginagawa natin. So this is the first piece, 1 over x plus 1 quantity squared if x is less than negative 1. The second piece is ito, 1.5 plus 1 over x plus 1. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. That's not our point here. So there are 4 pieces of the functions, of the piecewise function, and how do we graph it? If we look at the graph, there are 4 parts. There are 4 colors because there are 4 pieces of the function. So itong red na ito, this one, it's corresponding to this graph. So magmula negative 1. Yan. Magmula negative 1, yan. So it's approaching negative 1, that is an asymptote. Ito yung kaniyang graph. So syempre wala kang makikitang 1 over x plus 1 kapag higit pa sa negative 1 yung x value. Yung blue naman, that's the second piece. That is between 1 and negative 1. So, andito yung 1, ito yung 1, ito yung negative 1. If you look at the graph, blue lang talaga yung nandyan na graph because that's the interval for the second piece. And then we go back to the green graph, that is between 1 and 2. 1 and 2. That's the green graph. Ito, nakikita natin. And then of course, the last one, the purple. The purple graph, that is if x is greater than 2. X is greater than. Medyo may mali dito kasi nag-overlap. Hindi niya nilagay yung or equal to something. But the point here is there are 4 graphs because there are 4 pieces. And depending on which interval is that graph located, dun lang natin makikita yung graph. So hindi tayo makakakita ng green na graph somewhere here because the green graph is corresponding to the third piece and that graph should be only between 1 at saka 2. So this is the graph of a piecewise function. Are there any questions?
Ano yung mode sa calculator para yung exact?
Ano na yung mode sa calculator, sir? O fine, ganun?
Mode? What do you mean mode?
Yung mode na ginamit, sir, dun sa site na yung para maging exact.
Mode, hindi mode, setup. So shift, setup, and then piliin nyo kung nasaan ang radians, rad. That's 4, so ipipress ko yung 4 sa aking calculator. Yeah, so radians na siya. If I want to go back to degrees is corresponding to the number 3. So ipindot ko ulit yung 3, babalik ako sa degree. Yun, so bumalik nga sa degree dito. And for calculators, so halimbawa no, nag-divide ako ng 7 at saka 8. Pag lumabas ay ganyan, if you want to have the fraction part or the fraction equivalent, ito SD. Dito, pwede nyo palitan dito ang form. Right? So I want to go back to radians. It's 4. Okay, so naka-radians na ako. So what else?
How about yung paglagay sa pi, sir?
Pi. Pag makita natin ang calculator nasa baba, pi. So, sige. Crash course sa calculator, paggamit ng calculator. So, may nakikita tayong number, 7, 8, 9. So, pwede mong pindutin lang yan. Papakita na yung mga numbers, yung mga black. And then, above each button, merong mga functions dyan na either colored, is that yellow, parang orange, something, at saka may mga red din. So, to access those functions, kailangan pindutin natin yung shift. Yan, kaya ganyan yung color niyan. So, halimbawa, gusto kong makuha or gusto kong i-input si pi, since nandyan siya sa taas na naka-color yellow, kailangan kong pindutin muna si shift and then that button. Yan, so magbibigay siya ng pi. If I want Euler's constant, that's E, that's red, so I'm going to press this time alpha, and then the same button, it will give us the number E. If I want to input a variable x, nandito si x. So this button, but to access it, we need to press alpha. So alpha, and then this button, alpha, and this button, yeah, tama, x nga ang gusto natin. If I want this one, cube root of a number, it's orange, it's yellow. So shift, then this button, then that's cube root of whatever you want to compute. Cube root of 7, for example, yan, will give us the answer.